vanquish signatories. We appealed to the Group of Seven and the European Union leaders to approve the long-awaited decision to allow Ukraine to use Russian sovereign assets and direct them to compensate for the damages and losses caused and inflicted upon Ukraine and Ukrainians. The letter called on the world leaders to take several important steps. It was considered necessary to form an open register of frozen assets to disclose terms and conditions of their utilization. It demanded that until the final decision to transfer is made, the revenues should be directed to Ukraine and Ukrainians. According to the World Bank estimates, the cost of recovery in Ukraine had already reached 500 billion United States dollars. This number continues to grow day by day. As of today, the total volume of frozen sovereign Russian assets amounts to approximately 300 billion euro, including some 200 billion euro in the European Union. The Russian assets fail to compensate the whole quantum of losses of Ukraine, but they will be a significant contribution to the cost of saving and rebuilding Ukraine. Since then, many declarations have been made and a few important steps have been taken. On the 24th of April, the United States President Joe Biden signed the Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act, REPO Act, adopted by the United States Congress. It allows the United States to transfer Russia assets to Ukraine. The European Council at the level of the ambassadors has in principle agreed to seize windfall profits from Russian assets to finance arms supplies to Kyiv. The interest is worth up to 3 billion euro per year. However, on Tuesday, the EU finance ministers did not manage to say their final yes. They simply took note of the progress. There has been progress, let's admit it, but it seems quite moderate, doesn't it? The Kyiv Security Forum will be discussing this issue and other strategic topics today, and I'm pleased to introduce our distinguished speakers. I'm happy that Viola von Kramon-Tapp-Adel, our good friend, is with us. Thank you very much, Viola, for joining this conversation. Viola is a member of the European Parliament from Germany, and she is a member of the group of the Greens European Free Alliance. I'm happy that Natalie Yaresko is with us. Thank you, Natalie, for joining this conversation. Natalie is the member of the Kyiv Security Forum Security Council and former finance minister of Ukraine. I'm happy to see Philip Zoellick, who is a strong partner and true friend of Ukraine, senior fellow at Hoover Institution at Stanford University and former counsel of the United States State Department. I'm happy that Stephen Raitmaker, former United States Assistant Secretary of State, is with us. I thank you, Stephen, for joining this conversation. And I'm glad to introduce Arseniy Yatsenyuk, the chairman of the Kyiv Security Forum and former Prime Minister of Ukraine. Without further ado, I wish to start with Arseniy Yatsenyuk. So please tell us, what's your take? What do you think of the progress made? You're welcome.
Well, Danilo, my take is very simple and crystal clear. Russian frozen assets have to be completely seized and transferred to Ukraine, period. Look what's happening right now on the ground. Russia launched an offensive, and the situation on the front lines is very complicated. Russia still has an ability to finance its war chest. An average amount of cash that Russia is spending per year is around $120 billion. And look at this, it's even despite the fact that Russia is under severe sanctions imposed by G7 and the free world. So my take is that the situation is really complicated, and it all depends on both political will and the way whether we still believe that the rules-based order is viable and doable and will exist in the forthcoming future. Look what Putin did with his first trip to China after reappointment. He just issued a joint statement with the Chinese president or the boss of China, President Xi, where they severely condemned even an attempt to seize the Russian assets. So, in my humble opinion, this is a clear-cut rebuke to the free world, to the United States, and to the European Union, and it's an attempt actually to stop the G7 member states from seizing the Russian assets. So, from the legal standpoint, we have a perfect student of the legality of the way how to seize the Russian asset. This is Secretary Zoellick, and I won't jump on his wagon. But from the financial standpoint, and I would say from the standpoint of justice, it is clear that Russia is to be brought to justice, and Russia is to be prosecuted in criminal case, and Russia is to pay compensations, financial compensations. So to wrap it up, there is a legal basis to seize these Russian assets, as Russia committed an act of aggression. And it is to overlap and to correlate with the legal prosecution of the Russian Federation. And all these threats or fears that in case if the G7 or the free world legitimately decides to seize the Russian assets, this could dethrone the dollar or this could dethrone the euro, it doesn't deserve any attention. I know what could dethrone the dollar and the euro: the collapse of the democracy in Ukraine and the collapse of the Ukrainian state, and the collapse of the leadership positions of the United States and of the European Union. So my take is that the quicker the better. The G7 is to decide how and in what way to seize already frozen Russian assets. Because Ukraine has to win, and this war is for the long haul. This is the war of attrition. And Putin showed no intention to any kind of strange negotiations that some folks are talking. His only intention is to take over Ukraine and to undermine the global order and the free world, including euro and dollar. So we have to win, not Putin.
Well said, Mr. Prime Minister. I thank you very much for this strong message, I believe. I hope that our partners from abroad will listen to the substance of this message, to this demand which comes from Ukraine, that this issue should be settled. Philip, my next question goes to you. What's your take? How do you assess the progress made? And what kind of decision, in practical terms, on Russia's assets do you expect from the upcoming G7 summit in June? This is very important for Ukraine since we all look forward to that summit. We would like to see some practical results. We have a lineup of summits, G7 summit, then NATO summit. So we would like to have those summits as summits of success in practical sense. You're welcome.
Right. The situation is unclear because the battle is being waged right now about what will happen at the G7 summit next month. And so the 3 points I want to draw out for your audience. One, the issue is not abstract and moral, though it is moral. That is, there is a sense of, well, Ukraine has been badly damaged. It's appropriate at some point for Ukraine to get this money. I want to stress that the issue is urgent from the point of view of imminent budget gaps and imminent financial needs. The Ukraine's survival in this war depends on guns and money. Everyone has been talking a lot about getting the guns. Hardly anyone has been talking about getting the money. The money is as important as the guns. And in the case of the guns, we had some obstinate members of Congress in our country, but now we're moving on that. In the case of the money, though, the problem is not some congressmen in America. In the case of the money, the problem is a handful of fretful European leaders who have not yet decided what to do. And the battle is being waged now. So first point, it's an urgent fight, not just an abstract moral fight. It's a policy issue. Two, The move the Europeans announced last week at the level of ambassadors was presented as a major step forward. In fact, it was the worst of all the possible options that were actually on the table. The Europeans have taken a legal view that the earnings on reinvested Russian assets actually don't belong to anyone but a European bank called Euroclear. So the minimum option they had was to let Euroclear, this bank, simply keep all that money in the billions or do something with it. Since they didn't have an option of just saying Euroclear should keep the money, what they did then is say the money that Euroclear is earning, that Euroclear supposedly owns, well, we'll at least take that and use it not to give to Ukraine. We'll use it to offset European defense spending burdens. So if you kind of thought about the menu of possibilities as to how they could use the money that they had to use somehow, that was the worst of all the possible options. And then they present that to the world last week in all the newspapers as progress to help, when in fact it was the worst possible choice. It leaves alone all the other securities depositories that are holding Russian money and is actually a complete dead end. And the amounts of money involved, none of which actually would go to Ukraine in the European plan, are themselves completely insufficient. Meanwhile, the Americans are trying to come up with a proposal that would respect the French and German red lines, but at least front a lot of money to Ukraine right away this year to meet the urgent needs of 2024 and 2025, and then front that money on the European promise that all of these earnings would be used to repay that extension of money, over coming years. The Europeans right now will not even commit to do that. They will not even commit to repay the Americans if they front the money using the interest from the reinvested Russian earnings. They won't even commit to that proposal right now. But all these battles are currently in play. So the basic battlefield then is there's an American proposal that tries to stay in the European red lines, but at least fronts a very large sum of money to Ukraine right away this year by locking down the promise that at least those earnings that supposedly belong to Euroclear will be dedicated to paying that back. Call that Plan A. And then meanwhile, Plan B, which is the direct transfer of the Russian assets into a trust fund to help Ukraine, is also being readied, and we have some more authorities on this. So that battle then of at least trying to get acceptance of either the emergency Plan A or the medium-term Plan B, the full transfer that Arseny rightly called for, that battle is currently underway to see if we can make any headway at all by June to get a work program done before the American elections. So the final point I want to argue to your viewers is this issue is currently in play and is unsettled. They are battling about it right now. The current European position is actually pretty hard to sustain. One of the reasons that position is hard to sustain, and Steve may get into this a little bit, is because the Europeans claim that all this money is in Europe and that therefore they can just tax it. In fact, a large portion of the money supposedly in Europe is not actually being managed in Europe. It's being managed in the United States, in Britain, and in Canada by correspondent banks in which the Russian ownership of the cash is being hidden because it's all being commingled in Euroclear's cash management accounts inside the United States, Canada, and Britain. I think that the currently passed American legislation and some other things we can do have the potential to clarify that situation and make it clear that actually the supposedly European money is in fact substantially being held in North America and in Britain. And North America and Britain can make decisions about what to do with the money that's being managed in their jurisdictions. And then that may put a little more pressure on the Europeans. Folks should understand that the public story of why Europe doesn't move, the public French and German stories are not the real stories. I have direct information about this at the ministerial level. What's really going on behind the scenes is Russia and China and the Arabs are blackmailing the German, French, and Japanese governments by threatening to confiscate and liquidate private company interests, and by threatening not to buy French sovereign bonds on the open market. So it's not a general threat to the euro. These are quite specific national blackmail threats being focused on Japanese LNG, on German companies, on French sovereign bonds. So then my answer to that, and of course this is all invisible to the public, is that we should address those pain points in Germany, in France, in Japan. And there are a variety of ways in which we can help those countries manage these blackmail threats and move forward to do what I think they increasingly know they need to do.
This is extremely interesting. I thank you very much for these remarkable remarks, and this is what is very important for the Ukrainian audience and for the international audience to hear about those invisible games that are being played behind the scene. I think that maybe Arseny would like to reflect upon this. Because I saw your reaction, if you would like to say something, you're welcome.
Well, Philip, you're absolutely correct that something is going on behind the scenes, and the way you described it deserves the credit and full trust. So it's all about blackmail, and it all depends on the way how we respond. If Russians and China manage to blackmail an entire free world, so what the hell is going on this earth? So do we have tools and leverage to respond? Yes, we do. And it's all about the political will, because we are acting within the legality.
Thank you, Stephen. I would like to invite you to share with our audience your opinion, your take on the ongoing processes, and there is a very concrete question that I also would like to raise. What will you recommend the Ukrainian authorities how Ukraine can help our Western partners take necessary decisions? You're welcome.
So thank you. First, I want to commend everyone on this call for the work they've done to bring us to the point we're at. This is a critically important issue, and we're here and today able to report great progress has been made in Washington on this issue. Congress has passed a law authorizing the United States government to confiscate sovereign Russian assets that are under the jurisdiction of the United States. This was a long-term effort. It took us years here in Washington to work on this and bring it to successful conclusion. It was a controversial idea when we started. There were a lot of reservations. We had to answer questions about international law, about the global financial system. We answered those questions in Washington and formed a consensus here in favor of moving in this direction. And so the enactment of the repo law is a very significant development, but it's really just a start because it doesn't actually confiscate the assets. It authorizes the president of the United States to do that. And the Biden administration has been clear that they don't intend to exercise that authority on their own. They want to use that authority, but they want to do it in concert with other countries, with allies of the United States. And that's not necessarily a bad position because I think, as we all know, most of the money is not in the United States. So, to fully assist Ukraine, we need the rest of the world to move in concert with the United States. But I agree with the comments that have been made that it is urgent that we form that international consensus and then have the collective global action to confiscate the assets and provide them to Ukraine. And it's urgent both because of Ukraine's needs, but also because I think we need to anticipate that this war will end one day, and there will be a negotiation as part of the end of the war. I don't think the war ends with Russia surrendering to Ukraine. So there will be a negotiation about the terms on which the war ends. And we know what Russia will want in those negotiations. There'll be issues about borders and issues about whether Ukraine can join NATO and the European Union. But in addition, Russia will ask for two things. It will ask for an end of the Western sanctions, which is a reasonable request. If they end their aggression, we should end our sanctions. But also, they are going to ask for their money back. They've not forgotten that they have $300 billion in accounts all over the world. They will want that money back, and they will try to condition peace on return of that money. The strongest answer we can provide in that situation will be, it's too late. The money's gone. If the money is still sitting there as it is today, it may be very hard to resist pressure from Russia to simply return the money. So I think for that reason alone, it's urgent that we proceed to exercise the authority of the Repo Act and have our allies take parallel action to confiscate the money and provide it to Ukraine. And I will say that, the Repo Act does include a very useful feature which hasn't received a lot of attention, which is it restricts the return of it restricts the ability of the president to return the money to Russia. It contains language that the president is allowed to return that money to Russia only if some other arrangement has been put in place for Ukraine to receive compensation from Russia. So it tries to rule out as a legal matter saying yes to Russia in a negotiation that, well, as a price of peace, we'll give you your money back. And it contains legal restrictions. And then also the U.S. Congress would have to vote on whether to allow that to happen. So that's another additional restraint that the Repo Act included. And I think it's a very important feature of the law that will benefit Ukraine. I did want to make one additional point, which is I do think it's important to talk about the purpose to which the money should be spent, or the purpose to which the money should be put. I know that Ukraine has urgent needs, and it's tempting to use the money to buy weapons, to support the Ukrainian budget. I think it's important to resist that temptation, though, for several reasons. First, the basis under international law for confiscating the money is much stronger if we are using the money to satisfy Russia's debts to Ukraine than if we're using the money for some other purpose. I won't go into all the reasons why, but it becomes much harder to explain the legal basis for confiscating the money as an action in response to Russia's violations of international law if we're not using the money to extinguish Russian liabilities. Also, the countermeasures doctrine, which is the legal doctrine that provides the basis under international law, is to be used only to induce compliance with international legal obligations, and Russia has the legal obligation to compensate Ukraine. So it's a clear case of satisfying that prerequisite to use of the countermeasures doctrine. If the money is used for other purposes, it becomes harder to explain why this is a lawful measure. I also think it will be easier for Russia to accept the idea that it's not getting its money back if we're able to explain that the money has gone to pay off debts that Russia would have to otherwise pay from other Russian assets. So, they're not actually losing their money. Their money is being applied to debts that they would be responsible for if we return the money. And then finally, I think we need to have a candid recognition of the fact that if $300 billion is a lot of money, if the notion emerges that we're just going to use that money to support Ukraine, I fear that will become an excuse in the minds of many government officials to step back in their willingness to provide support to Ukraine. I think in a way we're fortunate that there was only about $5 billion in Russian money in the United States, not 200 billion, as in the case of the European Union, because if there had been 200 billion in Russian assets in bank accounts in the United States, I really worry that just a few weeks ago, instead of appropriating $61 billion to assist Ukraine, members of Congress would have said, we don't have to appropriate any money at all. We'll just take 61 billion out of the 200 billion of Russian money, and we'll give that to Ukraine. We'll use Russia's money. We don't have to do anything. And I think it's important that we not allow this asset the Russian assets that have been immobilized around the world to become a substitute for providing the kind of support that the United States and our allies have been providing up until now. We need to continue providing that support and then provide the money as compensation to victims in Ukraine, to the government and the people of Ukraine who've been victimized by Russia's aggression, and make that money available to them as compensation for the injuries they've sustained.
Stephen, thank you very much for your response, and I would like to thank you and to thank Philip for all your efforts that are aimed at settling this important issue, which is of vital nature and vital importance for Ukraine. Ukraine definitely needs the resources, and the latest uncertainty which happened in the United States Congress in this sense caused a lot of troubles and difficulties that we experience on the front. And for this reason, Ukraine certainly needs to have the issue of the resources settled, since this is war in which Ukraine should prevail together with all our Western allies and partners. And here I would like to invite Natalie Yarescu to give us this general big picture, if I may ask you. Your assessment of how strong you feel is the commitment of our international partners in terms of supporting Ukraine. What's your take? How do you see this?
Thank you very much, Danila. I have to be frank with you. I think the commitment is very strong. I think in Europe, the commitment has grown even greater month after month. But the reality is that politics is complex. And that's what we saw over the last 6 months in the United States. Despite having bipartisan support, it was delayed by 6 months, and that 6 months is the difference between life and death in many cases in Ukraine. And we are facing a multitude of elections across our allies, and it is not possible to know in advance who's going to win and the position of those who are going to win. We can all build scenarios, but we see the challenges with the EU rule of unanimity. We see the challenges of, even with bipartisan support in the United States, the delays. And so I think that even within this environment of great support and increasing support from Europe, I think that this issue needs to be resolved as soon as possible. I agree with Philip. I respect Stephen's perspective on legally the best way to do this would be to use it for the needs of recovery, rebuilding, justice, damages caused by Russia. But I will say that I think there needs to be some flexibility, because I don't have 100%, I'm not 100% convinced that the next supplemental that will be passed in the United States will have financial support for the budget of Ukraine. I'm the former finance minister, and I worry a lot about the budget of Ukraine. And I'm not sure the Europeans will be able to take up the slack, the missing piece, the 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 billion that was previously committed year after year by the United States. And I think something that we just all need to keep in mind is that budget deficit, that social budget that we call it, pays the salaries of civil servants. It ensures that the institutions in Ukraine are functioning. And that is the difference between fragile conflict states, Afghanistan, Sudan, and a conflict state. Ukraine is not fragile. Ukraine has functioning institutions, but that's only possible if you fund the social budget and you fund the civil service, you fund teachers, you fund doctors, you fund the salaries of emergency workers. And so from the perspective of what's needed today, and we know it's air defense, air defense, air defense, and then weapons, 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 I have to be frank with you that the budget is increasingly important. It's important for maintaining the state functionality. It's important to deliver the services that keep people home in Ukraine. It's important to convince others to come home to Ukraine without those institutions being fully funded on a timely basis, with some confidence of the funding happening. I don't know how you proceed. So I do understand Stephen's perspective that that's perhaps not the best legal option, but I have to say that flexibility is something I think is necessary, because we can't count on future leaders that we don't know who they will be and what their political situations will be to fund the needs of Ukraine on a timely basis. And so the military is a separate issue, and recovery needs funding now. If we think about what's happened since March, just the bombing since March 9th, the destruction of the energy system, 95% of our thermal power plants have been destroyed or damaged. 30 to 40% of our hydroelectric plants have been damaged, not destroyed, and hopefully never destroyed beyond what happened to Kakhovka last year. Think about the fact that this is often more than what is budgeted, more than what the World Bank said was necessary when they did their rapid damage needs assessment in February. This happened after February. If the rapid damage needs assessment said that we needed approximately 15 billion for this year to begin the critical recovery that's needed this year to maintain our economic resilience, then all of this is added to that. And you need to put something in place to have electricity, heating for the population by winter. It's urgent. That money's needed urgently. Yes, there are funds available from our partners, but is it enough? And can we count on it each time? So I would argue that some flexibility, perhaps money is fungible and there are different ways to look at how money's move to different categories. But the simple fact that we have the support of the West isn't the same as having timely knowledge and confidence of streams of funds that keep the front safe, keep the people safe, and keep the country whole.
Danilo, could I jump in?
Yes, you're welcome.
I think there's a way to compromise both Steve's concern and Natalie's concern. And the way my suggestion is this. I think it's legally permissible to allocate money that's set aside for damages in a trust fund for two purposes related to Ukraine. One is to meet what the IMF calls the external financing gap, or the budget gap. You see, Ukraine is having to sustain a war budget. The war budget has been imposed on Ukraine by Russia's aggression. So it's an extraordinarily large budget that then creates a gap of what Ukraine can normally fund from its normally available revenue that's caused by the war. So the budget gap is part of the damages caused by Russia's aggression. Then in addition, there's recovery and reconstruction investments that Natalie alluded to. So I think both of those things, that is, helping to close the budget gap and thus maintain the IMF program, can be seen as compensating Ukraine for Russia's aggression. Investments in reconstruction are also compensating Ukraine for Russia's aggression. I agree with Steve that money that simply is put in a bucket labeled military assistance is probably the least good way to try to allocate support for Ukraine. It's the most vulnerable to legal challenge. So I think Steve has a point. And so in order to address Steve's concern, don't channel the money in a way that is just clearly legally awkward. If you channel the money to help Ukraine close the budget gap and make the necessary recovery investments, I think that can be defended as compensation for Russia's aggression without getting into the bottomless pit and legally awkward labels that Steve was warning about.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Philip. And now I would like to invite Viola. Viola, by the way, just continuing this conversation, let me quote German Chancellor Scholz, who said that around 90% he thinks of revenues from frozen Russian assets should be spent on arms supplies for Ukraine. And here we have those skeptics, and we have the messages from Russia and China, blackmails, and so on. So share, please, your take. What's the European perspective? How this issue is seen in Europe, and how the general political landscape before the upcoming European elections looks like, and what's your general assessment of the situation? You're welcome.
Thank you, Danilo, for having me, for inviting me to this great conversation. And definitely I can mirror a little bit of how it is being perceived in the European Union, our member states. I'm running up and down every day. I I was just here in front of 700 school children. This morning we had 400 or 500 school children. And my main pledge is get ready to support Ukraine, because that is about our security. And of course, there are a lot of discussions going on, not just amongst youngsters, not just amongst politicians, but amongst the broader society. And many things have been said, which I definitely share. My concern is also if there is this so-called 300 billion euro or dollars, it's almost equal, then there is obviously less pressure for the governments to make sure that the state support, the state financial support will stay up. So yes, we have agreed last year, and we have voted on this year, of the 50 billion Ukraine facility, but that is definitely not enough. Yes, we can say, okay, as Madame Ursula von der Leyen last year had said during the London Reconstruction Conference, this 200 something billion is for the reconstruction. And then I can imagine in general there is an overall agreement, or there is a confirmation. But if you see that there are some member states, such as Austria and other neutral states, Ireland, there's less desire to pay for arms and weapons and military equipment. So maybe this is just an excuse, but nevertheless, we have to consider, as Natalka has said, there is unanimity, and it makes us extremely weak if we precondition this, or if we pre-place this already to the defense sector and only for arms selling. So I would say, in general, we need to find a different solution, and especially those obstacles of blackmailing by the Chinese, by the Russians, by others. That has to be overcome in a way which I have no idea how to do this. Of course, it's not just against the Germans. There are other financial players such as Luxembourg and others who seem to be very vulnerable to those blackmailing attempts. And I'm not enough of a legal expert. I'm not deep enough into this council decision to say how much the G7 have tried to compensate or to come up with a solution here. So maybe we can have a discussion here. But in general, I would rather say don't focus only on military delivery and military support when you speak about the 200 or 300 billion euros or dollars. I can follow that argument which was made by Stephen to say, in the end, Russia has to pay anyway. So Russia has to pay. There is a financial obligation because of the war crimes, because of the other threats, because of the destruction. This money needs to be found, and then we can actually already spend it now. I think that is something you cannot counter. But to focus only on the ammunition, even I fully agree. I mean, what's needed now is guns and money, and that is super obvious when you speak to the colleagues and when you speak to the soldiers. I mean, we all know we are at a very critical point, and but I mean, speaking about ammunition now, and speaking about Taurus, speaking about other long-term or mid-ranges missiles, that does not depend on the money. To be honest, I have heard nothing is a question of money. I think there is sufficient financial means to cover everything which is needed for Ukraine to become more resilient in military terms. That is clearly a lack of political will. And it's good to hear that the Chancellor Scholz tells us 90% of this will go to Ukraine and then weapon supply. But in the end, we need it quick, we need it swift, we need it immediately, and we have to fill up our storages here. And definitely, I see a big lack of announcing and proposing and implementing and realizing. So when you speak to military people in Germany, when you speak to the Bundeswehr, the army, they are not super happy with the pledges and the promises which are given then to Ukraine, because we definitely lack a lot of material in Germany, and we have not managed to fill up our storages or our storages here. So to come back, I think if we can find opportunities to compensate the blackmailing, which was mentioned towards the French, the Germans, the Japanese, I guess it would be super helpful if the G7 put this as a priority for the next summit. Second of all, I would not focus to blame Euroclear. I don't think that leads us anywhere. I would rather say the 200 or 300 billion is needed for reconstruction, is needed for running the state, is needed for more civilian expenses than only for military, because that makes the discussion within the European Union much easier. And it is absolutely right, as Natalia has said, we do not know whether the US after January next year will be able to finance the civil expenses of teachers, pensioners, I mean the state as such, in this amount. Yes, we cover part of that with the Ukraine facility, but I think we should get ready to use the 200 for this, plus additional money from the member states or from the Commission.